our first example, as you can see, is a number line. This is something that we're going to be seeing. We're going to see a coordinate plane, number lines, and so on and so forth. So let's go ahead and read the problem first. It says, find which two of the segments, XY, segment ZY, or segment ZW, are congruent. So what does congruent mean? We got to remember what it means up there. Up top it said that congruent means that we have two segments that are the same length. So what I'm going to do to each of these is first find out what each of these are equal to. So ZY, XY, and ZW. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to do the first one because you're going to find the rest of them. I'm going to find XY first. Now, I like the stuff that is easier, which is basically counting. All of this is distance, and so you have to remember, according to distance, if we were just finding the distance between me and a person, I wouldn't count my first step, I wouldn't count my position, me standing, as my first step. Literally, my first step would be the number one thing that I'm going to count. Why am I saying all this? Because if I look for the distance between X and Y, I'm not going to start on X, counting this as 1. No. I'm going to count this right here, this -4, as 1. So this is 1, 2, 3, and 4. Since it's distance, we're going to go ahead and say, well, it's 4 spaces between them. I also like to show the math so that way you understand what we're talking about. Now, since it is distance, we're going to make sure we plug in an absolute value because, as you can see, we have some negative numbers here, negative numbers over here, which might possibly make our answer negative, but since it is distance, it's always going to be positive. Let's keep moving. So this right here is -5 because it's between -6 and -4. And this right here, that's -1 because that's between -2 and 0. So remember, since it is distance, we are subtracting the two terms with each other. So saying -5 minus -1. And you'll see that that creates right here in this middle part a big plus sign. So we're going to have a big plus sign. And I'm going to rewrite this by saying that it's -5 plus 1, which ends up giving us, again, since it's the absolute value, it's going to be the absolute value of -4. And yes, the absolute value of -4 is going to equal to 4. Struggling there, sorry guys. So now, at this time, if you can press pause, I do need you to find ZY. I need you to find also ZW. And once you find those those last two things, I then want you to give me a congruence statement. So saying that these two segments are congruent to each other, which two are going to be congruent to each other? So press pause. All right, so now that you've gone ahead and pressed pause, I'm going to go ahead and count the information. So ZY, let's see, 1, 2, 3. ZY is 3 spaces between. ZW is 1, 2, 3, 4. And so that's 4 spaces between. And so since I noticed that these two have 4, then I'm going to say that XY, segment XY, is congruent to segment ZW. And how do I know that? Because both of them equal to 4, and so that is why I know that those two segments are congruent to each other. Okay, let's move on to example 2. All right. For any of these problems, you should always use your notes to go ahead and figure out what we're dealing with. To start with, if we go back to our first term, which says congruent segments means that two pieces are congruent to each other. And as we can see here, there are no congruent markings here. Those tick marks that I showed earlier, they're not on there. Well, now they are because I put them there, but they're not there. So we're not dealing with congruent segments. So that's a no. I'm going to look at the next term, which is midpoint. Midpoint means that the point has to be in the middle of the 2 points, and as you can see, it's not. So unfortunately, midpoint is not an option. The next one is segment bisector, which again, if we go back to segment bisector, it's kind of the same thing as midpoint, meaning that we have a segment or something in here in the middle that's bisecting the two segments into halves, into two equal parts, and that's just not happening. So I'm going to say that's not it either. And the only option that we're left with is segment addition postulate, which that kind of does look like it works. It is segment addition postulate. So what I'm going to help you with first is writing the geometry part. Once we write the geometry part, I'm going to let you do the algebra part. So let's go ahead and see what it says first. First thing it says that if AB is equal to 25, that looks kind of important, find the value of x. Okay, so they want me to find the value of x and then find the value of AN. And they want me then to find the value of NP. So they want me to find a total of 3 things. So that's what I'm going to do. So let's begin. So first off, remember the segment addition to postulate tells us, if we go back to our notes, that this piece, segment AB plus segment BC, is equal to the entire segment, which is segment AC. Then we have our segment addition postulate. So we got to write that first thing. So that's what I'll do. So segment AN plus segment NB is equal to segment AB. Yeah, that makes sense. Let me see. This part plus this part is equal to the entire thing. AM plus NB is equal to AB. Yeah, that makes sense. So at this point, press pause, find the 3 things that we need, which are X, AN, and NB. Press pause, please. Great. I believe you pressed pause. So I'm going to go ahead and finish up the problem for you to check your work. And so let's go ahead and do that. Well, the algebraic equation that you were supposed to write was 2x minus 6 plus x plus 7 is equal to 25. You can't forget that information's up there in the statement. So now I'm going to go ahead and combine like terms. I know that we have an x, 2x there, and an x here. So that's going to be a 3x. I know that this is a negative 6 and a plus 7. So those are different signs. So that's going to be subtracting, and that's a positive 1 is equal to 25. I then am going to subtract 1 from both sides, and I'm left with 3x is equal to 24. Remember, we have to isolate the variable by dividing by 3 from both sides of the equation, and so x in this case is equal to 8. Again, you were supposed to find the other information. What other information? Well, AN. And AN is equal to 2 times x, which is 8. We found that information. We were supposed to simply plug the information in. Minus 6. And so 2 times 8, that's going to be 16 minus 6, and so that's going to be 10. We then need to find NB, and we know that it's going to be 8 because x plus 7, so 8 plus 7 is going to be the information, and that is going to be 15. All right, so now we have our answers. We know that one of our answers is 10 and the other one is 15, and last but not least, x is equal to 8. We have one last example, so let's go ahead and finish up our work. All right, this last example says that M is our midpoint. That's an important word, midpoint, of the segment RT. It wants us to find RM, MT, and RT. We got to think about what information did I give us earlier in our notes. So I gave you 4 things: congruent segments, midpoint, segment bisector, and segment addition postulate. Well, I highlighted one word I underlined it with a blue line, And you'll notice that it's a midpoint. So if we go back to that definition, it says that it's a point that divides a segment into two congruent segments. And you'll notice that I wrote down a congruent statement. So you're going to do the same thing for this problem here. You're going to write down a congruent statement. If M is our midpoint, so if this one is our midpoint, that means that these two guys here should be congruent. So I'm going to do the geometry, and then I'm going to ask you to press pause and you do the algebra. So the geometry is saying that segment RM is congruent to segment MT. And at this point, that is where I'm going to leave you, because you're going to press pause and write the algebra equation and solve for RM, MT, and RT. Press pause, please, and get the answer done. Okay, so hopefully you realize that the equation, remember, if we know what RM is equal to, and according to this, my RM is equal to 5x plus 9, all I'm going to do is rewrite that information right underneath. So 5x plus 9 is equal to, well, if I know what that information is equal to, MT is equal to 8x minus 36. Well, that's what I'll write down, 8x minus 36. And there you have an equation, which you can then solve and find the information for x. So that's what we'll do. We're going to go ahead and subtract 5x from both sides. I like to keep my variables positive, so I'll be left with 9 is equal to 3x minus 36. I add 36 to both sides. And when I add 36 to both sides, sorry guys, gotta make this smaller. Okay. When I add it, I'm left with 3x is equal to, what is that? 42? Ooh, I'm doing that wrong. That is 10, 45. Divide 3 from both sides. I don't know what that is, so I got to do my division box. 3 goes into 4 one time. That's going to be 3. Subtract that. We're left with 1. Drop down the 5. 3 goes into 15 5 times. And so that's going to be 15. So x is equal to 15. Is that my answer? No, not according to this. It's asked me to find RM, MT, and RT. So I got to do that. I'm going to find RM first. So I'm going to do is plug in the information, and I'm going to go ahead and change that instead to this. RM is equal to 5 times 15 plus 9. And I don't know what 15 times 5 is, so I'm going to do that on the side. 15 times 5. 5 times 5 is 25. 5 times 1 is 5, plus 2 is 7, so that's 75. So 75 plus 9, and that's going to be, I believe that's 84. Now, remember, we started off first with a congruent statement. And so if I know what RM is equal to, technically, I know what MT is equal to, because they're congruent to each other. So MT is also equal to 84. Now I can verify that by plugging it into 8 times x minus 36, this information here. But again, I know that that has to be true. You should check just to make sure that everything is correct. And finally, to find RT, well, I'm going to go back to what I know. I know what RM is, and I know what MT is. And to find RT, I got to add 84 plus 84 to get my RT. And so RT is going to equal to 168. And I got all 3 of my answers. And that's it. Thanks, guys.